All right. Well, we had Doug for a second. Did we lose Doug now? Is he here?
Oh, he was
I'm
coming in.
here.
Oh, hey, Doug.
There he is.
How you doing?
Greetings from Texas.
Yeah. What's with the flower lay that you have going on there? You're not
No, exactly. The Texas Association. We're looking for the cowboy hat, Doug.
No. This is, my RV is called the Hula Roo because we have the little hula dancer on the dashboard that, jiggles around while we're driving. So we got to have a couple of lays.
Wow. I was just watching, man, what was it? I was watching a movie the other day where they used the hula roo to know if like they were in trouble. Basically, it's kind of like sort of like T-Rex with the water, but if the thing was jiggling, then they knew there was problems. I don't remember the movie now. So, Erica, that was not professional. So now we can cut that part out, in post. Yeah. All right, Doug. Well, I think you missed. You probably missed the data presentation. Is that true or not true? Did you see part of that?
That is accurate. I was logged in and did not have any audio or video. I was getting some kind of elevator music for a while, and then Paul Simon burst on the scene.
Yeah, well, it could have been worse. Well, we just talked about an audit that Lurch's team had run, and how basically 1 out of 3 properties would get flagged for something, as far as yellow or red flag, as we've talked about. And there were some questions that came through from the audience that you would be better able to answer than we would. So one of them that I thought I hadn't thought of before, but they asked about like, how do we feel about using the word walk in things, in particular, because it's called the walkability score. So if it's called the walkability score, why should we not be using the word walk?
That's a great point, and it depends on how fine HUD wants to create distinctions of what would be considered discriminatory, or really in practical terms is the answer to the question, do you feel welcome? And just like HUD decades ago found it necessary to publish a memo that said, listen, walk-in closet is not discriminatory. Great view is not discriminatory. Master bedroom is not discriminatory. The walkability index, I think, is ubiquitous in urban areas, and therefore I have been changing my opinion about the word walk to this, walk to that. I still prefer something other than walk, like easy access, only minutes from. However, the word walk is not an automatic red flag at this point in time. And I think that's an important point for everybody to understand, is that fair housing is not etched in stone. A lot of fair housing enforcement comes from the perspective of who is in charge. And while this administration clearly has re-energized the commitment to fair housing compliance, I also think that we've got to be careful not to overreact. And I think, quite frankly, I was overreacting with the word walk. In the current lexicon, I would not call that. I would prefer something else, but I wouldn't call it a major error.
Right. So is it fair to say that you talked to us quite a bit about how there's this gradient of a risk profile? And so what we had settled on was more of like having a red flag, yellow flag, right? And we would have red flag would be like, this is a clear issue. So previously you may have been considering walk or master a more of a red flag, and your opinions changed a little bit. Would you put it as a yellow flag, or would you just say it shouldn't be flagged at all?
I would actually, I as my thinking is evolving, I wish there were a red flag is an automatic, no Jewish guys allowed. That's a red flag. A yellow flag would be something along the lines of young professionals welcome, which isn't overtly discriminatory, but has the connotation of no kids, thank you very much. And then I wish there was something else that was walk. Well, can you find a better word? Walk's probably not going to get you in trouble. So at this point, I would say yellow, but only slightly yellow. I know that's crazy. It's more like butterscotch. I think walk no indicator. I'm gonna go on the record right now and say walk, no indicator. If you could find something better, great, but you don't want to make the system too complicated, correct?
Yeah, you don't. You want to make it too hard. Like Courtney was just mentioning in the chat that maybe proximity score would be better, but so many people understand walk as a measure of distance. And you had just been more advising our team previously, and my answer to one of her questions before was use like only blocks away or nearby or minutes, minutes, something like that, or proximity, close proximity. So it's almost like as with anything in language, there are different ways to say things, and you just got to decide where you want to fall. There's clear things you should not do, and then you should decide you want to be, for those folks that may be offended by the word walk, do you want to avoid that because you can use other language, and you don't have to you're not forced into using that word.
Correct, and also furthermore, in the context of what's going on today, where we are literally minutes away from all the issues that are going to arise out of the expiration of the eviction moratorium. And now there's conversations about whether landlords can require residents to be vaccinated. Whether you use the word walk in advertising and marketing is going to be way at the bottom of the list of what they're looking for.
Cool. Well, what do you see as the biggest area of concern for the folks that are watching are that you had spent years, we kind of did your background before you jumped on, not that you need much introduction, Doug, but we hit your background before, and you'd been in property management space before, running properties before you hit the consultancy side. And then when you started, working so much in fair housing. So I would imagine that earlier on you were intensely focused on more of the like leasing agents and how they treat people, the same. Versus now, do you still think that is the biggest opportunity for folks in the industry, or are there areas that maybe folks are not so aware of that they should be paying more attention to?
I see the biggest concern right now as consistency, and that directly relates to staffing, given the staffing issues, the staffing challenges that people are facing in terms of getting new people on board or retaining people. The role of training has become even so much more important. It was always important, and now it's huge because, at a restaurant, if you don't have enough servers, things slow down, and maybe you're going to lose a customer, somebody's going to go somewhere else. In the multifamily industry, you put a new person in without training, they say something. Many fair housing complaints and lawsuits are the result of somebody trying to be helpful. So the issue is training to be consistent, knowing what you can and what you can't say and do. And with the new people that are coming in, I'm already seeing practitioners who are just putting people in the front lines. And I have my fingers crossed that they don't say or do something that's going to get them in trouble. So training is paramount, and having a way to monitor what's going on so that a lot of people just get trained, but they don't then get monitored. It's not just attending a training course, it's attending a training course and then making sure that the person is managed to the training and that they are evaluated in terms of how they are interacting with people. Did the training stick? Did the training work? Or did they sit through it, virtual training, and they're checking their email while it's running on a second monitor, and then they go out and say or do something that is inappropriate?
Can I slide in a question here?
Yeah.
So I've asked this before, but I think it's good for everyone to hear your thoughts on this, Doug, which is around the optics, how much those matter when a lawsuit does take place. So as we're all saying, there's training is one of the biggest issues, if not the biggest issue. But and this may sound ridiculous, but I'm going to liken this to my little girl. I've trained her, I don't know how many times, to put the chip clip back on the back. And she still manages not to do it. So no matter how much training you put out there, as you said, a lot of times it's with the best of intentions, people trying to actually help somebody where they make mistakes. So therefore, connecting this to the optics, how much does that matter as far as, hey, we do tons of training on this. We have tools, ongoing sessions, et cetera, et cetera. Does that matter at all? Because typically when you get into the legal realm, it's like optics matter. And I feel like that's where the sensitivity also comes into play as far as, gradient. Like, are we comfortable with walkability or not? And if we're squeaky clean and we make mistakes, does that matter? Or, and you've taken, I think, the stance of, no, it doesn't. It's like violation's a violation. But if you could speak a little bit more to that, is it smart if you were operating today, would you say, hey, I want to be squeaky clean because the day will come, that they don't put the chiplet, I can't say it.
What's only worse than that is Nicole always asked me to order her an Arnold Palmer.
Yeah.
I'm like, this is impossible to say this. Like,
Yeah.
just give me a half iced tea and then lemonade, please. Thank you.
There you go. But I think you get the point is optics, sensitivity, like, and for marketers that are like on the fence with a lot of different words or approaches, is it helping them to be, super conservative, or is it actually not really matter when it comes to these types of complaints?
Great point, especially considering that a lot of people use the, hey, look at all this training we're doing as a defense. Bottom line is there's no guilty with an explanation in fair housing, in my experience. And it's important to be squeaky clean, as you put it. However, unless the sentence that begins with, we train everybody extensively, is followed by, and they manifest that training on a daily basis, and we monitor their performance, and we measure, and we know that the training they're receiving works, and if it's not working, we change the training. Unless you can complete the sentence with words similar to that, you could be training everybody on the planet, just like you're saying with your daughter. Well, here's the chip clip, and here's why we do it, and it's not getting done. So training by itself, nope. I mean, It's better than nothing, but it's close to nothing.
Right. Well, thanks for clarifying that. And then disparate impact is one that David and I first heard about a couple years ago. And so this for me is more like, I don't want to call it the boogeyman, but does it exist? How do you define that? How do you know if you are I guess impacting that or in trouble due to disparate impact? So if you could define for folks attending what disparate impact is and kind of your position or thoughts around it, because I think it's easy, as you mentioned, overreacting to say, okay, 7 degrees separated, like there was a mistake or something happened, and over engineer, I guess, kind of your reaction, I'll say, to fair housing laws and how to operate. So if you don't mind picking that up, it's defining disparate impact and then your thoughts around them.
Absolutely. And disparate impact is the antithesis to the fair housing training that folks like me who have been around for decades used to receive, because the fair housing training mantra was treat everyone the same, treat everyone the same, treat everyone the same. That's what we learned in fair housing. Disparate impact will get you in trouble when you treat everyone the same. Disparate impact refers to a policy that is neutral on its face. It applies to everyone, regardless of what protected class they're a member of. This policy applies to everyone. So let's just use the one that really started it all off, and that is Section 8 vouchers. We don't accept Section 8. Now, Section 8 is a federally managed program, and participation is voluntary. However, studies have shown that the vast majority of Section 8 recipients are people of color and people of certain nationalities. So that when you say, I don't accept Section 8, yes, you are treating everyone the same. Doesn't matter who you are, where you're from, what you look like, how you dress, what you listen to, what you eat. Does not matter. I don't take Section 8. Goodbye. That has a disparate or disproportionate impact on people of color and people of certain nationalities. So what's happening is I'm treating everyone the same, and yet I am engaging in discriminatory behavior, because if you are of a certain nationality or you are a person of color, it's much more likely that you receive Section 8. And so my policy has that disproportionate impact. The new mantra has to be treat every situation the same, not every person the same. So be consistent. We have a policy. Here's our business justification for that policy. And HUD has actually become more and more helpful in their guidance by issuing clarity or giving us more clarity as to what we're allowed to ask, what we can't ask, what we can share with the public. So disparate impact, how do you know if you're engaging in disparate impact? Very simple. If you're treating everyone the same, it's only a matter of time before you're going to get hit with a disparate impact claim. When you are staying informed about what's going on, the fact that you can't just unilaterally deny an application because somebody has a felony. You now have to look at specific crimes, specific felonies, and determine what is a threat to property and persons and what really isn't. You have to look at source of income. Is it a protected class? If somebody has a legal source of income, must you accept them if they meet your other criteria? So it's really, I think, the best protection against a disparate impact claim is being fully informed about what are the protected classes in your area and what is the HUD guidance with regard to when those people apply and what you're allowed to do and what are your responsibilities if you deny somebody.
Right.
Doug, that sounded confusing. It's like
I'm
treat everybody
sorry.
the same, but now don't. But like then you got to pay attention. I'm just saying it just shows how complicated this whole thing gets, right? So I can understand why. It's funny because when we started working on fair housing, we we're like, oh, this shouldn't be so hard. It should be simple rules. But then the more weedsy you get, the harder I feel like, the more complicated and the more muddied it gets in my head. So
I thought it was a beautiful and great explanation to a very confusing topic.
Okay.
But
Well,
yeah, totally. I very much get it. So that leads me to my next question that I thought also was interesting was around liability. And I'll say very specifically this scenario, Doug, where you have a property management company, you have an owner, and then you have a third party agency, i.e. insert Digible, some type of digital agency. And, certainly not intentionally, but some mistake has been made, and a complaint is filed. Who's liable? And so I think everybody understands that the target's probably going to be where the money, or like, let's just say it's one of the larger management companies, that's probably where the complaint's going to be headed, but they may not be the actual owner. And then what is the responsibility of the agency in that? Because they're the ones that actually executed the campaign. And I think in many cases, either owners or management companies do have faith or are believing that their agencies are not making those types of mistakes, when in fact, as David said, I said up front, there's still a huge education gap. So how does that all work when a complaint is put forward? Who is liable?
Okay, I'm going for a more elegant answer this time.
You could just say
everybody in a 5-mile radius. Really, what's going to happen is any attorney is going to name everyone involved because they're going to know that certain people are going to get dropped off. The key thing to remember is that HUD looks for what's called a pattern, and so does DOJ, the Department of Justice. They look for a pattern in practice. There have been numerous cases where somebody did something wrong, but they've been doing it wrong for years. And it wasn't, horribly bad, wasn't heinous. And so they got a slap on the wrist because they were doing it in good faith and they didn't know. And, sometimes in the early days of disparate impact, that was what happened, is you got a slap on the wrist because you'd been doing it forever. Today, what's going to happen is, you're absolutely correct. They're going to go for the person with the deep pockets, who is the management company, but they're also going to look at Digible and they're going to say, well, did you know this was wrong? Were you aware this was wrong? And if they can show that you knew, then you'll be liable. Now, how they allocate the liability, I'm not certain. If, on the other hand, you did it innocently, in good faith, and there was no way you could have known it was wrong, then probably you will get a slap on the wrist.
Yep. Very helpful. And then when we talk about the actual consequences, I guess, of these complaints, like from a financial standpoint, what does that look like? Is there a difference, like whether it's disability or whether it's a different form of discrimination, sex, age, gender, those types of things, whether it's, advertising or whether it's happening on site? How much can you share with us about the financial implications of one of these lawsuits?
Most of, and I want to make the distinction between a federal lawsuit and a complaint, because most things are adjudicated at the complaint level, which means that they go before an administrative law judge, which is kind of like an arbitration. And oftentimes these kinds of complaints are disposed of through a process called reconciliation, where if you are willing to go to training and pay a certain amount of money, and you don't have to admit any guilt, and then you can dispose of it.
Sounds like
have not
driving.
Huh?
Sounds like defensive driving.
Yeah. And you have to go to defensive fair housing class. Absolutely. I have not seen a great disparity in terms of the amount of the penalty with regard to, well, you did this because of race, but you did this because of national origin. We're going to really whack you for this one. It's more a function of how many times you did it, how often you did it, how many plaintiffs are there. So that to me is what the determining factor is, more than one specific class is costs more, to put it bluntly, than another. And let's put that in context of the last 6 or 7 consecutive years. Disability-related complaints have accounted for almost or more than half of all complaints filed. The last statistic from last year was 55% of all complaints said I was discriminated against because of my disability. And in second place for the same period of time were complaints that said I was discriminated because of my race. They were in the 10 to 15% of total complaints range.
Doug, I'm getting made fun of because I had a note that I accidentally sent publicly that said, "What about the future?" So I got to get to that, otherwise people will be like, "What was this note about?" So one, you've talked a lot about the administration change and the impact you think that's going to have. I think we might get into that more with Scott. But two, you've also informed us that there's certain areas like DC that are way more protective of different classes, and they have 20-something different classes. So my first question when it comes to the future is, if you could wave a magic wand, what protected class would you add to the national protected classes versus, what different locales are trying to add to make up for it?
That's a tough one, because my immediate answer would be LGBTQ. However, the courts have continued to expand the definition of sex, which was the 5th protected class added in 1974, as well as President Biden issued an executive order that specifically addresses that. So that really is a de facto nationally protected class. Having said that, I would say the next one would be source of income. In my previous life, I managed a lot of low-income housing tax credit communities, and Section 8 vouchers were money in the bank. And Section 8 in reality is, people look at Section 8 like, oh, it's really bad, and it's those people. Who are those people? I've managed luxury buildings that I had worse residents than I had in public housing, and vice versa. I've managed tax credit properties where the resident cried when they got the keys because they'd never had a place so nice. So I would say if sex is going to include LGBTQ, then the next one would be source of income. Yeah, there are right now, source of income is not a get out of jail free, because even though source of income may be protected, some people still find a way to deny them based on their credit history or their landlord history or their employment history. So it's no guarantee that on a local level, whereas if you made it a federally protected class and specified, well, let's see, if they're receiving a voucher, they probably don't have good credit. So you gotta have a sliding scale. I forget, what did they call that in school when they graded you on a curve? So some of your qualifying standards have to be on a curve, taking into consideration that if you had wonderful credit and a wonderful income, you wouldn't qualify for Section 8. Hello. So that would be it. Sex and Section 8.
Yeah, that's great. And then you've talked a lot about the different administration, like the new one coming in versus the old one, and what impact that may have. And you mentioned the eviction moratorium. So I'm kind of teeing this up to say, what I have actually two questions. I'm trying to figure out how to wrap them into one, but I guess I'll just go right to it. So it seems like the law moves very slowly. As Lurch said in his session, fair housing has been around for more than 50 years at this point, and we've added some stuff over time. But what do you think are going to be, like, you put yourself, you said on the record, but just go out on a limb and say, what do you think are the most drastic changes that we may experience? I'll give a little bit of context, saying, like, this industry we experienced just 2-3 years ago, where ADA for websites all of a sudden became like a thing, and people were freaking out, and you saw nearly every website vendor start adding tools or things to cover ADA to make sure websites are more accessible. My sense of that was that didn't actually happen until people started seeing the lawsuits come in. So when it comes to fair housing, we have not felt the same urgency on the marketing side. I don't know if they feel that on the operation side, but we just haven't heard the same chatter where people are, like, all of a sudden concerned that, like, we need to just improve ourselves. So just leaving that for you to take and say, like, what do you think could be the most drastic change that you think is likely to happen in the next few years?
I'm going to respond to that question with what's going to be the most contentious thing that's going to happen. And I'm going to say AFFH, Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing, which is a program that HUD was working with prior to the previous administration, which totally put it on a shelf and stopped it. This administration is resurrecting it. And the reason it's contentious is because it seeks to integrate neighborhoods. And you have two schools of thought. One is that it's social engineering, and how can the government force me to have neighbors that I don't want, even though most of the time they don't want them based on fallacies about who they are. And the other is, well, how do we, when this eviction moratorium really manifests, the lifting of it manifests, now you're going to have even more homeless people. There's a critical shortage of affordable housing. So you have more people who are homeless during a pandemic. And one of the biggest blocks to creating more affordable housing is this not in my backyard mentality, which AFFH could somewhat remedy. So I see that as the real battleground, not so much that we're going to have a bunch more protected classes, but we're really going to have to confront the fallacies and misconceptions about who people are and how they live and how, the cultures interact, and how to resolve the issue of homelessness. That really is, to me, at a big source of what's going on.
Great. Well, Scott, do we have you?
Yes, I finally worked through the system and I'm here.
Yeah, no, well, thanks. I don't know, Reed, do you want to comment, or do you want me to take that comment? Well,
meaning his shirt.
Thank you. And he belongs in the RV with Doug.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know how we didn't see this coming.
Well, I do love the color. feeling like
Great.
to up our games, but between Doug's lay and Scott's shirt, yeah, very vibrant. We appreciate you coming on, Scott. Sorry for the hiccup and getting you online with us, but I don't know if you want to provide the introduction, or Scott, you want to share a little bit about your background. I stumbled through it, and apologies if I didn't do you good there, but I think one of the more interesting things, and I couldn't speak very eloquently to it, is the public health, like the kind of the umbrella of public health, and then where this sits underneath that. Maybe a good jumping off point for you, but how long you've been focused or starting to put attention on fair housing, interpretation of these laws and whatnot. What led you to that? And I don't want to say what are you most excited about, but we just were talking about the future, and I think that's also fascinating to hear as far as the work that your team's doing and kind of the vision for all of it. So take it away, Scott.
Well, I just came off teaching a class in the public health school here at Temple, and our topic was a really interesting new paper that emphasizes the importance of law and policy in understanding our health, and highlights the fact that the world that we live in now, whether it's the world of how much housing we have, the world of how much taxes we pay and how much money we keep and who has that money and how we get to work, and the food we eat and the air we breathe, all of that is so heavily determined by law that we can't think of fixing the problems in those areas unless we think about how law is both helping to cause those problems and can be a way to change them. So that's why I'm here, and that's why I'm interested in housing, because obviously we don't have enough housing, and we don't have enough housing at the right price in this country. And that's not because people don't want to build houses. It's not because people don't want to occupy houses. It's not because housing prices are too high alone. It's also because pay is too low. You have somebody coming from all different directions. We have not just a history of racist interference with the healthcare, with the housing market, a policy of socially engineering segregation, but we have the ongoing effects of that, and the legacy that we all live among of still highly zoned, kind of impermeable neighborhoods that are hard to change. So all those things together are sort of how you dealing with all those at once is our challenge, and law is mixed in with all those things.
Yeah. So Scott, I think most people in the audience, they're related to property management. I think they may have come across your work because of the work you guys did with Law Atlas a number of years back with scanning the country for fair housing laws. So if you wouldn't mind, could you just walk us through why you picked that project? Because when it comes to public health and law, there's a lot of different areas you could focus, like healthcare that you just mentioned. So why did you guys pick fair housing for that? Tell us a little bit about that process, and then what were some of the outcomes that you guys learned from scanning the country?
Well, years ago, I did a big study of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is a law that's quite similar to the Fair Housing Act, and we essentially looked at every case that had been brought under the Fair Housing Act, both in the administrative system and then in the courts, for a period of 10 or 15 years, at both the state and federal level. And what we found was that we had a pretend system of adjudication of civil rights enforcement, because only a fraction of the cases that were brought were actually investigated. So most people, they file a claim with the EEOC and nothing would happen. And maybe it was a frivolous claim, and maybe it was a meritorious claim, but who knows? Because the agency was so small in terms of its capacity in relation to the demand for civil rights action that we didn't have a functioning system of employment discrimination management, right? And so I was interested in what, to the extent to which we might find sort of similar problems with the Fair Housing Act. To what extent do we, how many claims do we have every year, and what happens to them, and so on. And so as a first step to that, we thought, well, we better figure out who's doing fair housing law and capture that. But, as I got into housing and doing that work, and as Matthew Desmond's work came out about eviction and all the stuff that has now become so prominent, I realized, well, wait a minute, I think we have to put anti-discrimination law in perspective. The most important thing for housing in America is to have more of it, and to have a better match between what people can pay and what it costs to build and operate rental housing systems and to build, residential real estate. And then when you start to realize that, you realize, well, yes, discrimination is a real problem at the edges. It's a real irritant in important ways, and it's a terrible social blot. I mean, we shouldn't have discrimination in this country. But we moved on also to then looking at eviction law and how that worked. And I think the next frontier for us has got to be trying to do something with zoning, because that's all these are the big legal questions.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, we just talked about ADA a second ago because we were mentioning that 3-4 years back, we saw folks in the apartment industry start to really move on making their websites more accessible. And it seemed like that happened, my sense of it was because people started to see some lawsuits come through like Radio Shack and others. And they're like, shoot, we don't want to get caught with that. And then what I was asking Doug was what would it really take to get folks, to get them moving the same way about fair housing? And some of that, I like how you said sizing the problem, because some of it may be like, is fair housing much of a problem? And I know you saw some of the data that we sent you yesterday about it actually looks like there's a problem because 1 in 3 properties have some sort of an issue that they should take a look at. But I also totally respect that from your angle as a researcher, you're saying, well, sure, we should have laws that protect different classes so it prevents discrimination. But at the same time, it sounds like you're seeing the bigger fire burning when it comes to actually getting the housing built or the right type of housing built. Is that right?
Well, another way to think about this is, because you're right, we should have a well-functioning fair housing system. We should make sure that discrimination is not happening, and when it happens, that it's dealt with. And I think that's why the system you guys have developed is so important, because it's proactive and it's preventive, and it goes into a realm that right now is kind of opaque to traditional fair housing, advocacy legal types. They can't see what you can see. I also think it's important because a great place to start with enforcement is with the presumption that the people you're enforcing the law against actually want to comply. So we're not starting with the view that we have today a bunch of major rental agent, businesses that actually want to discriminate, and they're just figuring out how they can get away with it. I think it's much more of a different problem, which is we got all this law. How do we make sure we comply with it? And we have pretty complicated ways of targeting advertising to people that we think can pay the rent in our properties. So how do we make sure that in that process we don't inadvertently discriminate? Now, that's not going to cover everybody, because there are definitely some people who say, I just don't want any of those kinds of people in my housing or something. We are going to need fair housing law. But I think as much as possible, making this a well-functioning system that capitalizes on voluntary compliance is, the optimal way to reduce the rate of discrimination.
Cool. And Doug, I'm going to give you a chance to ask Scott a question, but I'm going to ask him one more question first. So if you don't have a question, you can just not have a question, because I know you're so used to having all the answers and not very many questions. So. Well, Scott, my thing is around, I sent you a note about self-policing versus more of things coming down from the government. So I'm wondering what your stance on that is it, because I mean, this is a big conversation in the tech space, where it's like, well, Facebook and the social networks and the tech giants should be self-policing, and then they wouldn't get the scrutiny of the feds. But then folks can start to do just enough maybe to not get this, get the fire. So I'm just wondering how you think about that in your line of work. Do you think it's more important around self-policing, or do you think it's more important about for government to come in and take action, or are you going to give me a Reed answer and say it's really a blend of the two?
Well, I think it'd be Reed-ish, but I think theory and experience tells us that pure self-policing rarely works, because people are driven by other imperatives and won't do what we want them to do. So you got to have a clear rule. That's the first thing. And we have a clear rule, I think largely in the form of the Fair Housing Act. Then you have to have ways to make sure that the people who don't comply get caught and get appropriately sanctioned to deter them and get them back into obeying. But you also have to realize that most people probably want to comply. So there you have to have tools that help them comply. And that's what you guys have built. You guys have built a tool that takes people who are inclined to obey the law and makes it easier for them to do it. Now, if there were no law, they probably wouldn't buy your product, right? So it's not just pure self-interest. Facebook isn't doing this on its own. It had to get sued to deal with this issue at all, and other places aren't dealing with it. But once we have a way to deal with it, and we have a rule that says you have to deal with it, then theory would tell us that in terms of regulation, that probably most companies are going to do it.
Right. And I would venture to say if there's no rule and you want and an industry decides not to try to do any self-policing, you may not like the outcome when it actually does get the attention of government or policymakers, because they just aren't as educated on how tech works or whatever. So better to at least take some steps forward to do something so that you don't end up with something you completely disagree with.
Right. I hate to go all big on you here, but I mean, this is kind of about how capitalism works. Capitalism, when it works like it's supposed to work for itself as a system, is about people doing what they need to do to make more money. And they don't care about anything else. And the system ultimately doesn't produce any other good, but more money being made. So we got to step in and say, what would we actually like our housing world to look like, aside from people making money in it? And we would like it to be a world in which people are not suffering discrimination because of who they are or how they're paying for their housing. And we'd like it to be a world where we're building the housing we need where we need it, and not having that stopped by arbitrary legal rules. And we'd like to have a rule where, a world where people are making enough money to pay the rents that people have to charge to be able to make that business work. That's a market-driven system, but it's not a market-defined system. We're trying to use the law to define a better world than the market is going to give us. And that's why we need law, and that's why we need tools to make law not be a big pain, but be a good prod.
Yeah, great. Well, Doug, do you have a question or comments?
I do. And Scott, by the way, thanks. That's great stuff. Great stuff. I'm curious that at this point of the research, as you're going through this patchwork of state and locally protected classes, have you what's your opinion about just having a federal fair housing law that when I'm in Florida, there's only 7 federally protected classes and no state protected classes. When I'm in the District of Columbia, there's 22 some odd protected classes. Do you think it would contribute to that, which I completely agree with you, vast majority of people who want to comply, to just have one set of this is what's protected and not have to figure out, well, the real estate department doesn't have it, so I have to see if there's an equal opportunity commission or a human rights commission, or how do I find out who's protected? And what are your thoughts on that, please?
Well, this is a question that goes right to one of the biggest fights going on in sort of public health and law, and I think generally social justice and law across the country, which is the idea of preemption. This is the concept we're talking about. Should we have one set of rules that define it for the whole country or for the whole state? And the biggest argument for preemption is exactly what you're talking about: uniformity. Why should we have to, especially if you're a multi-jurisdictional operation, why do you have to learn the laws from 43 different places? And there's nothing wrong with uniformity, broadly speaking, and some very good things about it. On the other hand, one of the things that uniform rules generally constitute is the lowest common denominator politically. That in the whole country, what can we get Congress to agree on? And as you know, these days, Congress it doesn't agree on much, and it doesn't do much. So then you go to the states and say, well, all the states are different. Can we have, rules that work for just the whole state of Mississippi or the whole state of New York? But then you find out, well, even there, Birmingham feels very differently about some of these issues than the whole state of Alabama does, or Poughkeepsie feels differently than the whole state of New York. So they want to add or subtract something. So politically, and sometimes that adding or subtracting is good in the sense that it gives us a chance to try out a new rule. Like, what happens if you have source of income protection in a Fair Housing Act? Is that a good thing? Does that have good effects, bad effects? Sometimes it allows us to make value judgments that may differ from place to place. In a place where people feel more strongly about a higher minimum wage, or where the economic conditions are different, they get to have the minimum wage, and the people who live in a different area don't like it, where most of the voters would vote against it, they don't have to have it. So you have this dance. The thing about what we're talking about here with Digible and what we're doing with our data is taking a different tack to sort of cut this Gordian knot. And that is, can we make it easier to know, given that we have this diversity, can we make it easier to know what the rules are and easier for people to comply with them? And frankly, that's one of the reasons this is an exciting, project to be continuing, because if we can just turn it into a machine operation and you don't have to think about it, then we kind of solve that problem. It doesn't matter if, San Francisco wants to have 20 categories and the feds want to have 7.
I do have a follow-up on that, and it comes back to what you mentioned, Scott. I think it was on the Disability Act, but just the capacity, I guess, to handle the cases, what's adjudicated, what's not. And so my question is, with a tool like ours or other tools that I would expect to follow, if you're then able to more readily identify, concern, risk, violations, it could be a 10, 20x problem from what we currently have sized it at. And that was one of the interesting things about the audits, is just getting a sense of how big the issue is. But that was without having access to digital advertising across the country. That was more what we could see publicly. And there was even more that we could have done with that. So that's just, I don't want to say wrapping this up, but how concerned are you about that? If we're able to identify more of these issues?
Well, that goes back to the theory of regulation and the art of regulation. There's going to be kind of maybe 3 classes of people when you do these audits in a company. You'll find some companies that have a lot of violations. One group are going to have a lot of violations because they're actually out there to build, say, whites only buildings, and then there have to be cases against them. But if you find those big violators, then the cases are efficient. It's better to have one case against a big violator than lots of little cases against occasional violators. So that's going to be efficient. The second group are going to be those people who just didn't realize that they were doing this. And you're going to take care of that, because now they're going to realize it. Why, we really don't need to sue them. They'll just, okay, we got this tool, we'll just rejigger our systems. And then sort of third related group are the ones who just didn't even have a clue. Like, they never thought about this. They didn't know they had to do this. And again, there with a little bit of assistance, they'll just comply. So I actually think that by focusing our attention on big violators, but also getting rid of a lot of big violators by just helping them, this could be a boon to, efficiency in the regulatory system.
Yeah. And there's all those complaints that don't get answered now. Meaning, like you're saying, Reed, there could be more because you find more. Like if an agency were to use
way more.
Yeah.
I think there's way more.
Right. And now there's already a lot of complaints that don't get investigated because there's already low resources. Because
Exactly.
right now,
Yep.
most of the stuff has to be done by humans if someone complains, or then they're like, well, where's the proof? So sorry, it's just tacking on that. You're right.
And I know we're excited to have our next presenters ready for our panel on consumerization. So we do need to wrap up. But I'm going to slip in one last question here, and that's around big tech. So, Doug, when I was asking about liability, I actually didn't mention Facebook, Google, or anybody else. One of the things we are trying to help educate folks about is that there are still many loopholes available, I'll say, to agencies like us that would allow, again, not intentionally, but for us to discriminate, whether it's federal or local, in the way that we set up campaigns, target those campaigns, the creative that we put into those campaigns. And there's nothing that's preventing us, meaning through the platforms themselves, through big tech, to stop that. There was action taken following the Facebook complaint, where there were some restrictions and, kind of native now inside of Facebook, and to a lesser degree, I'll say Google, that would help improve the picture. But what are your thoughts, as you guys, I think, have had some education yourselves, like in working with us and talking with us about digital advertising? How I'll say satisfied are you with how with big tech, and what role do you think they should play in helping fix this potentially much bigger problem?
Scott, I'll let you take that one.
Big tech, this is just another area in which big tech has to do a lot more than it's doing. They invent the systems, they, pioneer the use of and the construction of the algorithms. They make it into an inescapable business and service out there. And then they kind of say, well, what, us? But what did we do? Well, we're just a conduit. And both our politics and our law are a little bit slow in kind of catching up to what a digital dominated world looks like, in everything from antitrust law and monopolies to regulatory to regulation. I'd like to see a world of public policy in which Congress is taking all this a lot more seriously and thinking about everything from busting up monopolies to having more regulations about responsibilities. In the absence of that, turning tech's tools towards the regulation of tech is what we're talking about. Learning to play their game and then integrating that into the existing system. If we can help people working in that system to comply with the law, that's a huge thing. If we can help people on the outside, the fair housing advocates who right now, who used to look for violations in newspaper ads and now have to somehow find violations of social media. If we can help them do a better job, do their old job better, then I think, at least we can say we're making more progress than the government is making.
Definitely. Well, appreciate those thoughts. I think one of the biggest wrinkles with the big tech is that many people have no idea they're being discriminated against. That's what's unique with the digital advertising. It's like, well, I didn't know you were or weren't targeting me. Why I did or didn't see that ad. And so there's some interesting cases recently. Doug shared one with us where I guess the idea of that was brought forward and how it was settled. But that's more, I think, of things to come, like a sign of things to come as people get more acquainted with, their data, how it's being shared, what it all means, and could potentially have kind of a groundswell of people, voicing their concerns around digital advertising. So great stuff, guys. Can't tell you how much we've appreciated working with both of you, and the thought leadership, the guidance, and kind of the bidirectional, I'll say, education, and hopefully, fingers crossed, Scott, things go well with the grant, and we're able to work on this project for a good while together.
Great. Well, thanks, Scott. Thanks, Doug. I guess we're going to do one more transition, another 1 minute break. Things will refresh and people will be back on.
Bye-bye.
All right.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for the invite.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. We'll talk to you later.